Welcome back to Torah on the Go. We're so excited to see you, whether you are working out, walking the dog, stuck in traffic, or sitting at work, taking a break. We are glad that you are choosing to study Torah with us, the clergy at Valley Beth Shalom, sitting right next to my friend, Rabbi Ed Feinstein.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
We are going to talk about Genesis 50, the very last chapter of the book of Genesis. We're winding down the season as we get closer and closer to the very last sentence, last verse of Genesis. And I want to talk a little bit about reconciliation today. So the brothers meet Joseph, hate Joseph. That's how the story begins.
Right.
They hate him. They take him. They rip off his clothes, throw him into a ditch, take him out of the ditch, sell him into slavery. He gets sold into slavery. They come. They depend on him. They appeal to his senses to feed them. He reveals himself to them, and then their father dies, and they feel vulnerable all of a sudden.
Right.
They feel like they stand before a very powerful person who can exact a tremendous amount of revenge on them if he wants. And the Torah goes on to give us this verse. Vayomer alehem, Joseph says to them, Vayomer alehem Yosef al tira'u, ki atachat Elohim ani.
Yeah.
Don't fear, because I live under the auspices of God. How does that lead Joseph, do you think, to a life of greater compassion, to a life of greater forgiveness? How does that lead? How does a life of godliness lead to a life of reconciliation between brothers?
This is such a subtle moment in the text, and a powerful moment, and an insightful moment in the text. Let's go back a minute. They throw Joseph into a pit and sell him into slavery, which for a pretty 17-year-old boy is probably a fate worse than death. And he ends up by hook and by crook, first in the house of Potiphar, then in the prison with the baker and the cupbearer, then in front of Pharaoh, and he ends up as the prime minister of Egypt. They give him the daughter of Potiphar to marry, right, which is a really interesting...
Got to be an awkward situation.
A little detail, yeah, a fun detail there, right? And he has two kids, and his sons are Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim means I have prospered in this land of my exile, and Manasseh literally means I have forgotten those guys back home. I have forgotten the pain that I suffered in that family. He has a new name, Tzafnach Paneach. He wears a mask. Nobody knows who he was. He doesn't want to know who he was. And for 21 years, he lives that life. And then one day, his brothers show up in front of him. What is he to do with those brothers? He could ignore them. After all, that's what his son's name meant. I want nothing to do with these guys anymore. He could destroy them because they deserve it. He now has the power to exact his revenge. And he plays with them. There's a whole testing. Takes one brother, then he takes his own full brother, Benjamin, and he holds him. And Judah appeals to him, and he realizes his brothers have grown. His brothers have matured. He realizes something about himself, and something stirs inside of Joseph. And for the first time, he wants to be known. He takes off the mask. He cries in front of his brothers. He says, Ani Yosef Achicha, I am Joseph, your brother. Od Avichai is our father, still alive. He wants relationship. It's an amazing scene that this man who has so much power in the world, controls the world food supply, that's not enough for him. Someone needs to know his name. Someone needs to know his heart. He wants relationship with his brothers. And they reconcile. And the father comes down and he cries over his son, and the son over his father. And they live together now for another 21 years. And now the father dies. And he's been living 21 years with these guys. Like 21 years and peacefully. And they come to him and they say to him, before Dad died,
right,
he left instructions not to kill us. And Joseph hears this and realizes the wound has not healed.
Joseph knows it's a story. I always feel in the start, we don't know that he knows it's a story, but I always feel...
Of course he knows.
He knows this is another concocted scheme by the brothers.
Right, but what does he know? He knows that, and this is true, so true of families, right? There are family wounds we can heal and family wounds we can't.
And there are also family members who change and grow, and family members who don't change, who don't grow.
Right.
And that's, I mean, I always feel in this final scene, Joseph stands as a person with a great deal of maturity before brothers who are still the same teenagers who threw him in that pit.
They still have that quality.
That's right.
Maybe Judah has grown.
That's right.
But the others, they're still manipulating.
That's right.
They're still handling. They're still trying to make it their way. And they're still so suspicious. They're projecting their own guilt on him. They're projecting their own manipulation on him. And and he knows that, this wound isn't going to heal.
Right. But the way that he expresses it is the beauty of the end of the narrative.
Right.
It's the beauty of his growth and maturity. The way that he expresses it, Tachat Elohim Ani, that God is above me. There is a judge above me that will judge what happened, but I am okay with my life.
Right. Or the other way around. Am I God?
Am I God? Right.
God has put us in this position, fellas. He now realizes that his life has been part of a vast divine plan. And he can see that plan. And that's what gives him reconciliation. That's what gives him peace. That he now sees the upstairs. My teacher, David Hartman, used to talk about upstairs history. Downstairs is what happens to us day to day. But every now and again, you climb upstairs and you see the whole panoply and you realize why I'm here. Look where it got me. Look where it got me. He can see that. They can't. They can't. They're still, they're still playing. They're still handling. They're still manipulating. So he says, he found his peace. He really found his peace.
As we get closer and closer to the very end of the book, we'll reflect more and more on the entirety of the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
But the way that Joseph explains this reconciliation as Tachat Elohim Ani makes me go back to the very first example of two brothers that we talked about, Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
Right? Is the reason that Cain kills Abel, and then Cain turns around and says, am I my brother's keeper to God? I didn't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Is his problem that he is not Tachat Elohim? Is his problem that he doesn't recognize godliness as the divine rule of the world?
Mm.
That he tries to step up beyond godliness. He tries to make himself a god. He tries to execute his own judgment on his brother. That kind of jealousy manifests in this evil way. By the end, we have a brother actually saying, I don't need to exact revenge. That's not what life is about.
Right.
I've realized that the judgment, that there's a true judge in the world. It's not me.
And if you step out of the text for a minute, ask yourself, who wrote this text and why? And at what point in history? Right. At some point when the people of Israel were at each other's throats, right? The kingdom has split, or we're in exile. Right. And the question of, what are we as a people? To be able to say what's called upon is to be one.
Right.
There's a oneness. And this is what Cain couldn't understand, that he was responsible for his brother. He was related to his brother. His brother's heart was in his chest. And it's what Esau and Jacob only understood at the end of their lives, after the exile. And it's what each of these sets of brothers has to learn. And the writer of Genesis, the editor, the people who put Genesis up as a holy book, wanted us to learn this, right? You have to see your brother as yours. You have to find a way beyond the rage, the revenge, the unmet expectations and disappointments, and say, nevertheless, I love you. Nevertheless, you're part of me. We need each other. And that's what that moment is. That's what this remarkable moment of truth.
And that's the grand arc of Genesis. Is we begin with, am I my brother's keeper? A question that we ask God, and we finally arrive to this moment where Hine ma tov u'ma shevet achim gam yachad, right? Yeah. How lovely it is when brothers can sit together under a kind of divine umbrella of love, compassion, justice, all of these ideas, all these divine, beautiful attributes that Genesis presents, we finally live in this world.
Yes, but what's so brilliant about it, as you've pointed out, is that they still have all these faults.
Correct. No, they're not perfect.
There is a lot of bad stuff still in this family. And it's not that they all become saintly. You know, if I were writing the Bible, I'd Photoshop this thing and I'd make them all into saints. You know, they'd all become righteous and good and kind. And that would be a saintly Bible, except it wouldn't be true. The truth is that every family has stuff, that every family has tension, rivalry, vengeance, disappointments, failures. Every family has this brokenness. And yet the Torah is begging us to still see that the bonds that hold us together need to overcome the brokenness that holds us apart. That's the brilliance of the story.
And as we close the book of Genesis, and we're going to do this over the next few episodes, the ends of the book, the very last chapter of the book of Genesis answers many of the questions that have been laid before us throughout the book. And this idea of reconciliation, the idea that brothers can forgive one another, is something that was first brought up between Jacob and Esau, who are the first brothers to forgive each other, but certainly not the first brothers to reconcile in this way, understanding that they reconcile with God as a partner.
Right. Yeah, I think that your observation is very accurate, that so many of the loose ends of the book are brought back here, right? In each chapter of this book, brothers are at each odds, they're exiled, and here they're brought back together. There's a unity to this family, despite all the stuff.
Right.
And that really is what the story is trying to get us to understand. Not just, am I my brother's keeper, but really the great question, which is, Ayeka, where are you? Right? And the answer is, I'm a part of this family. I'm a part of this family, and that's how I identify myself.
Well, on behalf of the unity of the book of Genesis, on behalf of the unity here in this podcast recording studio, we want to offer you a little bit of unity, a blessing of unity in your life, a blessing of oneness, a blessingness of reconciliation and forgiveness, and a blessing of living in a more godly world.
Yeah, and at this very difficult year, this very difficult time, I think that this is a beautiful lesson to finish with, because seriously, the Jewish people have suffered terribly this year, and we all have different visions of how this should come, what should come next, who should lead us, what are the policies. But let's not forget this lesson. We need each other.
We have each other.
We need each other. We can't survive without each other, and we're a very small people in a very big and very difficult world. And deep inside, there is a deep need to hold each other and protect each other.
Amen. See you next time.
Stay on the Peloton.